Whispers of the Cloister, the hidden lives and silent sins of medieval nuns. In the hushed corridors of medieval convents, the world seems still, sacred, and untouchable.
Outsiders.
The cloister was the purest of sanctuaries, a place where women renounced earthly ties to devote themselves wholly to God. Behind stone walls, veiled figures moved silently through ritual prayers, their lives seemingly free from temptation, desire, or corruption. But as history teaches us, appearances are often deceiving. When we look closely at the lives of medieval nuns, we uncover a world far more complex, filled not only with devotion, but also with longing, repression, and whispered secrets that the Church tried desperately to silence. The Middle Ages were an age of deep spiritual discipline, where the body was seen as a dangerous vessel of sin, and the soul was locked in constant battle against temptation. Women in particular were regarded with suspicion, viewed as easily swayed by desire and susceptible to the whispers of the devil. Within this worldview, convents were meant to be fortresses of purity, stone enclosures that shielded women from the dangers of the outside world and from themselves. Yet those same walls that protected also imprisoned. Inside, human nature did not vanish. It persisted quietly, surfacing in subtle acts of resistance, forbidden affections, and unspoken confessions. Life within the cloister was rigidly ordered. The toll of the bells dictated every moment, waking before dawn for prayer, chanting psalms, attending Mass, working in silence, then returning to more prayer. Meals were plain, conversations restricted, and personal freedom almost non-existent. Some women entered willingly, driven by genuine faith or a desire to escape marriage. Others were placed there by families eager to secure status or avoid costly dowries. For these women, the convent was not only a spiritual refuge but also a cage, where individuality was stripped away in the name of obedience. Yet even in the strictest silence, the human heart found ways to speak. Historical records, confessions, court proceedings, inquisitorial documents hint it lives far more turbulent than the serene image of veiled devotion. Nuns confessed to battling impure thoughts, to experiencing visions of shadowy visitors, or to forming secret bonds of affection. Some stories reveal tender companionship between sisters that crossed into forbidden intimacy. Others speak of hidden letters passed to men beyond the gates. These accounts, whether exaggerated by clerical suspicion or rooted in truth, reflect the undeniable tension between human desire and the crushing weight of spiritual discipline. The Church reacted to these whispers with severity. To falter in the cloister was not just weakness, it was a betrayal of God Himself. Discipline could be brutal, fasting until the body weakened, public humiliation before the community, self-flagellation, or long isolation in dark cells. At times, accusations escalated into charges of heresy or possession, as if ordinary longings could only be explained by demonic influence. In such a world, even a fleeting moment of weakness could become a matter of eternal damnation. And yet, beyond the harsh punishments and fearful rhetoric, what emerges is a deeply human story. The nuns of medieval Europe were not simply saints or sinners. They were women navigating impossible expectations. Their so-called silent sins were not always acts of rebellion, yet signs of survival, small assertions of humanity in a system designed to erase individuality. Their struggles remind us that beneath vows, veils, and stone, the same desires, fears, and hopes beat within their hearts as in ours. As we peel back the layers of myth and devotion, we discover that the cloister was not only a place of prayer, but also a crucible of repression. Every whispered secret echoed against stone walls, magnified by silence, until it became a story powerful enough to reach us across the centuries. In this episode, we will step into that hidden world, exploring the lives, the temptations, and the punishments of medieval nuns. For within their whispers lies the paradox of the Middle Ages, a society that sought to extinguish desire, yet could never escape its shadow. Life inside the cloister. To understand the hidden lives of medieval nuns, we must first step into the cloister itself. A convent in the Middle Ages was not merely a religious institution. It was a world apart, bound by its own rhythm, rules, and silence. For those who entered, whether by choice or compulsion, life became a cycle of prayer, labor, and discipline, seemingly untouched by the chaos of the outside world, yet marked by its own inner struggles. The day began before the sun rose. Bells rang through the cold morning air, pulling the sisters from their narrow beds. Sleep was brief, for nights were often interrupted by vigils, hours spent chanting psalms in dimly lit chapels, their voices echoing against stone walls. At dawn, the community gathered again for Mass, their eyes heavy with fatigue, but their spirits bound by duty. From this moment forward, every hour was carefully structured, each task mapped to reinforce devotion and obedience. Prayer consumed much of the day. In the cloister, words were not casual or spontaneous. They were sacred recitations, repeated with precision, chanting the divine office, copying scripture, or meditating on sacred texts. The nuns immersed themselves in a rhythm designed to suppress individuality and tether the soul to God. Silence was both a rule and a weapon. Conversation was limited. Laughter discouraged, and personal expression viewed with suspicion. The convent was, above all, a place where the voice of God was meant to drown out the voice of self. Outside of prayer, the sisters worked. Depending on the convent's wealth, their tasks varied: tending gardens, preparing food, weaving cloth, caring for the sick, or educating children. Manual labor was framed as a form of penance, a way to discipline the body and remind the soul of its dependence on God. For many nuns, this labor also offered fleeting moments of release and escape from the suffocating silence of the chapel into the tangible rhythm of hands and earth. Meals were simple, often meager: bread, vegetables, sometimes fish, rarely meat. Eating was done in silence, with readings from Scripture or the lives of saints filling the air. Even in this most basic act of human survival, the nuns were reminded that their bodies were instruments of discipline, not pleasure. Fasting was common, both as a rule and as personal devotion, pushing the body closer to weakness, which the Church taught would strengthen the spirit. For many women, this life was not chosen. Families sent daughters to convents for reasons of status, economy, or convenience. A girl from a wealthy family might bring a dowry and be groomed for leadership within the convent, perhaps becoming abbess one day. A girl from poorer origins might find herself performing endless chores, with little hope of rising in rank. In either case, their fates were largely sealed once they passed through the convent gates. For some, the cloister offered refuge from an unwanted marriage or the dangers of childbirth. For others, it was simply a prison imposed upon them by the will of fathers or brothers. Despite the rigid order, the cloister was not immune to the outside world. News of wars, political shifts, or heresies sometimes reached the nuns, carried by visitors or traveling clergy. Wealthier convents might maintain contact with noble patrons, while poorer ones struggled to survive, their walls crumbling and their food supplies dwindling. In either case, the sisters lived in tension, withdrawn from the world, yet never fully free of its reach. Amid this life of prayer and silence, the human heart remained restless. Young novices especially often struggled with the abrupt transition from freedom to enclosure. Some whispered their doubts during confession. Others expressed their fears in diaries or secret letters, few of which survive. But those that do reveal deep emotional turmoil. The ideals of piety and obedience clashed constantly with longing for family, companionship, or simply a life outside the walls. To the Church, The cloister represented purity. The women inside, it was a crucible. Within its walls, devotion was tested not just by temptation but by loneliness, monotony, and the burden of obedience. For every nun who embraced the life with fervent faith, there was another who carried hidden doubts, secret desires, or unspoken despair.
Wow.
And it is here, in this structured but suffocating rhythm, that the seeds of silent sins were sown. For the more strictly the body and spirit were bound, the more the whispers of forbidden thoughts began to stir. Before we explore those whispered confessions and the punishments they brought, we must first remember the world in which they were born. A world of bells, silent stone, and endless prayer. World where women were asked to become saints, but remained achingly human. Hidden temptations and confessions. If the cloister was designed to extinguish desire, history reveals that it often did the opposite. Within walls built to silence the world, the human heart whispered even louder.
Ow.
Behind veils and vows, temptations found their way into the minds of women who had been told to see their bodies only as vessels of sin. What the church called falling from grace was, in many cases, simply the persistence of ordinary human longing in extraordinary circumstances. The sources that speak of these temptations are, by their nature, tangled in suspicion. Many accounts come from inquisitorial records, trial transcripts, or confessions extracted under duress. They are colored by fear, exaggeration, and the moral imagination of an age obsessed with sin. Yet, even through this distortion, one truth shines through. Repression did not erase desire, amplified it. Some confessions describe visions during prayer. Nuns admitted to being visited in dreams by shadowy figures, sometimes saints or angels, sometimes darker presences that stirred emotions they could not fully understand. To their confessors, such visions were evidence of demonic interference. To us, they may reveal the blurred line between devotion and desire, where intense spiritual focus spilled into the realm of physical longing. The body and soul, though forced apart by doctrine, remained entangled. There are also whispers of secret bonds within convent walls. In an environment where affection and comfort were scarce, friendships could blossom into intimacies that frightened both the women involved and the church authorities. These were not always physical. Sometimes it was as simple as lingering touches, hidden notes, or shared moments of tenderness. But in the rigid framework of cloistered life, even the smallest deviation from absolute chastity was seen as a grave transgression. More daring still were the rare cases where nuns reached beyond the convent walls. Historical records speak of secret correspondence with priests, patrons, or even passing travelers. Some tales are clearly sensationalized, designed to shame or punish. Yet others hint at genuine attempts by women to reclaim a sense of agency, to carve out small spaces of freedom in a life stripped of choice. Such acts, however, were perilous. Discovery could lead not only to disgrace, but also to brutal punishment, even accusations of witchcraft or possession. The confessional, meant to be a place of absolution, often became a stage for these secrets to surface. Nuns poured out their doubts, their struggles, their impure thoughts to confessors who recorded them with alarm. To the women, it may have been a desperate attempt to seek understanding. To the church, it was evidence of sin that demanded correction. Some confessors even encouraged harsher penances, convinced that spiritual discipline could root out what was, in truth, a deeply human need for affection and connection. The medieval imagination was quick to blame the devil. If a nun admitted to desire, it was said to be the devil's whisper, the intrusion of a demon who sought to corrupt purity. This interpretation gave the church a convenient narrative. Women were not just weak, they were battlegrounds for cosmic struggle. The cloister became less a sanctuary than a fortress under siege, where every stray thought could be cast as evidence of a demonic attack. But if we strip away the language of sin and temptation, we find a story that feels strikingly modern. These women were isolated, cut off from family and freedom, expected to live lives of silence and obedience. In such conditions, it is no surprise that their minds wandered, that their hearts sought connection, that their bodies rebelled against discipline. The so-called sins of the cloister were not monstrous perversions. They were echoes of humanity that refused to be silenced. And yet, the tragedy lies in how these confessions were received. Instead of empathy, the women found suspicion. Instead of compassion, they met punishment. Their whispered admissions, offered in vulnerability, became weapons turned against them. The very act of confessing one's weakness often bound them tighter to cycles of shame and discipline, reinforcing the power of the institution that had sought to erase their individuality. In the end, these hidden temptations and confessions reveal not the corruption of the convent, but the resilience of human nature. The cloister could dictate prayers, restrict movements, and impose silence, but it could not extinguish longing. Desire persisted, shaping itself in dreams, in friendships, in secret notes, in guilty confessions whispered behind wooden screens. These were the silent scenes of medieval nuns, born not from wickedness, but from the simple truth that no vow, however sacred, could erase the pulse of the human heart. Punishment and silent resistance. If temptation was inevitable within the cloister, punishment was just as certain. The medieval church, terrified of scandal and obsessed with discipline, reacted to the smallest hint of disobedience with severity. For women bound to vows of chastity, silence, and obedience, even the whisper of transgression could unleash a storm of humiliation and pain. Yet in the shadows of these punishments, we also glimpse acts of resistance, small, subtle, and often silent, that reveal the resilience of the human spirit. The range of punishments imposed on nuns varied widely. Some were symbolic, wearing coarse garments as a sign of shame, kneeling in the chapel for hours while others walked past, or fasting until the body trembled with weakness. These were meant to remind the offender and everyone watching that sin was not private but communal, that one woman's lapse endangered the purity of all. In more serious cases, the penances grew harsher. A nun might be confined to her cell for weeks, denied food except for bread and water, or subjected to flagellation before her sisters. In the harshest instances, accusations of repeated disobedience could escalate into charges of heresy, even demonic possession. Such punishments were not only about correcting behavior, they were about control. By turning confessions into public spectacles, the Church reinforced its power. Every act of penance reminded the sisters that their bodies did not belong to them, but to the institution and to God. A whispered desire, once spoken aloud, became the property of authority, to be judged, shamed, and erased. And yet, even under these heavy chains, resistance found its way into the cloister. Some nuns endured their punishments outwardly, while holding fast to their inner lives, refusing to surrender the small flickers of individuality that punishment sought to extinguish. Others turned to writing secret diaries, hidden poems, or letters that slipped past the convent walls. A handful of these texts survive, revealing voices that refused to be silenced, women who questioned, doubted, and even mocked the rigidity of their superiors. Silent resistance also took subtler forms. A nun might appear obedient but secretly fast, less than ordered, or deliberately linger in moments of forbidden companionship. Some feigned illness to escape harsh duties, or pretended greater piety to divert suspicion. These acts may seem small, but in a world where every movement was monitored, they were sparks of defiance. They demonstrated that even within walls built to suppress, human will sought ways to survive. The most striking examples of resistance came from women who turned the language of faith itself against authority. Some claimed mystical visions that could not easily be dismissed, using the ambiguity of spiritual experience to carve out space for autonomy. Others embraced extreme acts of devotion self-inflicted, penances that both satisfied expectations and shielded them from harsher punishments. By wielding the very tools of the church, they created a paradox, appearing obedient while preserving inner independence. Of course, not all resistance succeeded. Many women broke under the weight of punishment, their spirits crushed by humiliation, isolation, or fear. Some confessions bear the marks of desperation, nuns admitting to sins they never committed, simply to end interrogations or escape harsher treatment. The line between truth and survival blurred, leaving behind a record that tells us as much about oppression as it does about transgression. What emerges from these stories is a haunting contrast. On one side, the Church's determination to stamp out desire, using punishment as both deterrent and display of authority. On the other, the quiet endurance of women who, in their own ways, refused to let their humanity be erased. Their resistance was rarely loud or violent. It was often hidden, silent, carried in glances, letters, or private prayers. But it was resistance nonetheless. In the end, the punishments of the cloister did not fully succeed in silencing desire. They may have scarred bodies, humiliated spirits, and filled records with tales of sin, but they also revealed the limits of control. The human heart, though battered, continued to beat in defiance. The cloister may have demanded obedience, but the whispers of resistance carried anechos of individuality that survived even within the strictest walls of stone. As we leave the cloister behind, its echoes linger. Lives of medieval nuns, so often reduced in official records to tales of sin. Temptation and punishment reveal far more than simple failure to live up to vows. They reveal the profound tension between human nature and institutional control, between longing and repression, between individuality and obedience. For the medieval church, the convent was meant to be a fortress of purity, a sanctuary where women could transcend the corruptions of the flesh. Yet the very existence of countless confessions and punishments shows how fragile that ideal truly was. Human desire, however deeply buried beneath layers of silence and ritual, refused to disappear. The cloister did not extinguish it. It magnified it, turning every thought, every gesture, every whisper into a potential act of defiance. In these hidden stories, we see not simply sin, but humanity. The women of the cloister were not demons or saints. They were human beings, struggling under extraordinary expectations. They were expected to embody angelic perfection, to erase themselves in service to God. Yet their longings, doubts, and affections remind us that even in the most repressive conditions, the human heart asserts itself. What the Church branded as silent sins were often acts of survival, of resistance, or simply of being alive. It is easy to view their struggles through the lens of scandal, as their contemporaries did, or through the lens of judgment, as inquisitors intended. But if we listen closely, we hear something else. Voices seeking connection. 8. Women yearning for compassion. Individuals wrestling with the burden of impossible vows. Their whispers are not confessions of guilt alone. They are testimonies of endurance. The punishments they endured, humiliation, isolation, flagellation, were meant to erase individuality and enforce obedience. But paradoxically, they preserved these stories for us. The very records intended to condemn now give voice to the silenced. Through them we glimpse not the failure of women, but the failure of an institution to truly control the human spirit. And what do these whispers mean for us today? They remind us of the universality of desire and the futility of absolute repression. Across centuries, cultures, and religions, the attempt to crush longing has only ever transformed it, never destroyed it. The cloister walls may have been thick, the rules severe, but within them lived women who laughed, wept, doubted, and loved just as we do now. Their world may seem distant, yet its lessons are not. In every age, institutions have sought to discipline the body, to dictate what is acceptable, to shame those who stray. And in every age, the human heart has resisted. The stories of these nuns remind us that true humanity cannot be confined by stone or silenced by ritual. Desire, affection, and individuality are not weaknesses to be eradicated, but essential parts of what it means to be alive. So, as we close this chapter of history, we return to the whispers of the cloister. They are not simply whispers of sin, but of survival of voices that endured in silence, waiting to be heard centuries later. They call us to look past judgment and see the humanity within repression, to recognize the resilience that blooms even in the darkest of places. In the end, the cloister tells us less about failure and more about persistence. The persistence of desire, of individuality, of the unyielding human spirit. These women, confined and silenced, left behind more than stories of temptation. They left us reminders that even under the heaviest weight of control, the heart continues to beat, quietly but defiantly, whispering truths that no stone wall can contain.